Марк Львович. Где он? Здесь? Дорогие коллеги, мы...
Colleagues, we are getting started. There never is a vacuum, so try to get closer from the back rows. Territorial differences of education is the name of our session. Overall set of sessions, and the honorary paper is by Mark Carnoy. Regional differences in using regional differences to estimate the effects of state and mid-level management in Australia, Brazil, and the United States. Martin Carnoy. The second speaker is Mark Agranovich. Subnational differentiations of education outcome, international comparisons. You have the earphones. We have simultaneous interpretation available. Can you hear the translation? Choose the language and we can get started. We have an hour and a half. On a tentative basis, okay, more or less 30 minutes. 30 minutes for Mark Agranovich, 30 minutes for Martin Carnoy. And then questions, clarifications, understanding, and comments and discussions. Mark first, and then Martin. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I will be presenting a fairly new survey that started only 3 years ago. It's an OECD survey on subnational differentiation of educational systems. It's a pilot survey, and I will dwell on the first results of the survey, on the hypothesis that can be built based on the data obtained, and what is necessary to make this survey an important information source for you, for us, for all OECD member countries and non-member countries. Regional educational differentiations does not need any explanation in this audience, but that again, it's a matter of human capital, of investment attractiveness of territories, and how people will be living there. Will they leave or will they stay? For Russia, it's a topical issue. We are very, very much differentiated country, and the regional DP's differentiation is 16 times, unemployment-wise 20 times. We are very much differentiated country, and we have been saying that to use uniform approaches and uniform assessment methods does not make sense quite often. Therefore, trying to understand how the system is differentiated in other countries is quite important. The assessment of subnational educational systems is not something new. The EU has been doing this. Eurostat is implementing it using quite a few indicators, and importantly, all those indicators are linked to the areas of development recognized as priority areas by the EU. And no doubt, the aim is not for assessment, for ranging or ratings building, but any user can, of course, build his own rating. They are structured and formatted in such a way that countries can see benchmarks and use benchmarks as reference levels to understand where they're strong, whether they're weak. In a similar fashion, in some countries, I'm only using two cases. Other countries do hold subnational surveys. Scotland has a system of regional educational outcomes linked to the priorities and outcomes recognized as important. In England, up until 2010, there was a system with 198 indices and indicators, not only education-wise. Every region would choose 35 to assess themselves, and then it was decided that let them do their job, rendering social public services, education, healthcare, and stop do senseless reporting paperwork, which is something good. In 2010, the system was terminated. OECD, 2016, ONS initiated as part of the ENES program, which is a statistical research and studies program, which comprises all OECD member countries plus partner countries, including Russia. So it initiated a survey of subnational educational systems. The initial results are in 2017, Education at a Glance, and the data is on the site of the National Center for Educational Statistics in the United States, and they were the ones who launched this, and you can find the data and the tables over there. Russia immediately joined it, since it's of genuine interest to us. Myself and my team have been actively involved in this, in data collection, in results discussion, attempting to improve the survey. 2018, another area was added, whereby data began to be collected about conditions of learning and teacher pay levels. We decided not to join that. One, because the set of indicators is such that it's now a wonderful centralized systems. They're more or less the same. The number of the size of the teaching load. So let's go back to the survey started 3 years ago. In 2017, it included Belgium, Great Britain, Germany, Greece, Ireland, Spain, Italy, Canada, Poland, Turkey, Slovenia, United States, Finland, and Sweden, and 3 partner countries, Brazil, Colombia, and Russia. For us, of utmost importance is the United States, Canada, and Brazil. 2018, Australia joined. I list those countries which data on which major countries with substantial differentiation between regions, climate-wise, social economic status, and other characteristics. What is collected is education level by various age groups, employment by level of education, expenditure per pupil per student per year, age, specific coefficients of coverage, particularly for children, and coverage of younger age school children for preschool and primary school education. Educational outcome, educational levels of the population. It's a major index to assess the investment attractiveness of a region. And for us, of utmost importance are two groups. Us meaning developed countries and medium-level development countries, where the share of the population with tertiary education. In Russia, it is vocational training and higher education, including graduate and postdoctoral studies. And conversely, a population with the lowest level of education, because it's social security related matter. So it's a population in this case lower than high school education. The first results of the survey. This shows interregional differentiation in the share of population with education level less than high school education. Minimum is green, blue is maximum, and orange is the average, national average. And you see the names of the countries covered. That's a typo, sorry. Lower than high school education. In large countries, not large, but what we can see on this chart, that despite the fact that such countries like United States and Russia, large countries with large differentiations between regions, in fact, the gap between the minimum and maximum values is not big. Canada is a separate case because, as you can see, the average value is very close to the minimum. Canada is second from left. The gap in Canada was influenced by one region with a population of 33,000 people, Nunavut. It has what we call ethnic minorities living there, and almost half of the population don't have high school education. If you remove Nunavut, the gap on this indicator will be even less than the United States. We'll go back to the factors later. A slightly different picture is for interregional differentiation of education levels on the share of population with tertiary education. Here, conversely, large countries, United States, Canada, and Russia, show the greatest differentiation levels and gaps. We see that these countries have very different regions in terms of tertiary education levels. Employment levels. Let's look at two indicators. Employment of people with education less than high school. Here the gap is quite big. While the previous slide showed differentiation for lower than high school education, but for these, Russia, Turkey, strange it may seem, Canada and Italy, they have a pretty big gap. The last country is Slovenia. It's a separate case. It has no differentiation virtually for any indicator. I don't quite understand why Slovenia is taking part in this survey. We have 85 regions. Slovenia has 153 subnational entities. I'm not quite convinced that every territorial union has a school of their own, whether it's a community or not, and what they're doing in this survey is not quite clear to me. Of course, we're always happy to have everybody else in the survey, and happy for Slovenia. The level of employment of population with tertiary education, including master's studies, we see the biggest gap is in Russia. That shows a differentiation in terms of development level, technical, industrial development between regions. Italy and Greece, not the richest countries in Europe. The United States, Canada, Russia, more or less close. Smaller countries have smaller gaps. The variation in education coverage of children up to age 4, at age 4. Strange picture. Gigantic gap with regard to preschool education in Russia. In the input data, then it's 4, 5, 6. I put it at 4 because age 4 school education is mandatory. So I took the last age group when the people are not yet at school. Big gap in the United States. A strange picture, pattern. In Russia, with the average of almost 90, the minimum is 20% for Russia. That's Caucasus republics with their mentality. Mothers should stay at home and take care of children. And the coverage there, the preschool education is pretty low, and plus the economic status does not allow them to send them children to preschool and to educational establishments. Similar picture is in Greece, where one southern territory is not in the survey. What research questions can be raised? Quite natural is to look at factors affecting regional differentiation. The size of the country, the size of the population density, regional differentiation in terms of economic development, having national administrative entities populated predominantly by national minorities. The number of administrative entities, which I have already mentioned. Slovenia has made the picture so much worse. Limitations and constraints of research, which makes this analysis very complicated or impossible sometimes. Number one is a small number of countries involved in the survey. Any statistical analysis of links and connections having 12 or 17 countries in the sample is not necessarily representative. The second issue is much more serious. It's that we don't have contextual data, a lot of contextual information and data. Attempt to look at national sites, population size, density. Sometimes is successful, sometimes is not. And we don't have contextual information in many areas. And the absence of this contextual information, in actual fact, does not make it possible for us to analyze financial indicators, and I'll tell you why. With regard to education expenditures, which is an important and necessary indicator per student, per school student. But the issue is that not only in Russia but in any country there are differences in terms of purchasing capacity of national currency and people.
The purchasing power of national currency can vary in Russia from 1 to 16. That is, the difference could be as high as 16 times between some regions in Russia. So without using whatever coefficients which would allow to compare the educational spending by the region, without doing that, financial indicators do not make any sense to consider at this point in time, in my view. These are the per student spending on primary and high education from 4 countries only. We can see Canada here with a big gap there. Russia has a huge difference, as you can see here. But if you apply to Russian regions and educational spending, if you apply a factor of fiscal spending as used by the Russian Ministry of Finance for subsidizing those regions, then the difference would go down 3 times. The extreme, the rightmost arrow, that's the adjusted educational spending for Russia. And I expect Canada is about the same, because their northern territories require a lot of spending, and my research produced very little result. They should have just one coefficient that they seem to apply to the northern territories, something around 3, to be able to compare the regional spending values. And of course we need to be looking for ways to address this problem, how to compare inside the same country educational spending in the correct form. Only then international comparison, because international comparison is easy. You just take the PPP and that's it. But how you do it inside a country so that the comparison makes sense, that's a big question mark. Hypotheses. Again, the sample was very small, so in this case we can only discuss hypotheses rather than dependencies. The first interesting thing to observe is the linkage between the interregional differentiation of education and unemployment. We take tertiary education here, so we take the share, differentiation of the share of the population having the tertiary education, and the differentiation in the level of unemployment of the people of the same level of education. The picture looks nice. The higher the regional differentiation is, people with tertiary education, the higher the level of unemployment. That is just a hypothesis that looks sensible at this point in time, but which demands to be double-checked, verified on much larger samples, of course. Another hypothesis is density versus preschool coverage, preschool education coverage. In the countryside, of course, it is much more difficult, or in places where density is low, it is much more difficult to organize and provide access to preschool education. Although there is some linkage, so it seems here, the higher the density, the lower the differentiation on preschool education coverage. That hypothesis sounds reasonable, but again, it needs to be verified in the future on larger samples, and I hope the research will be joined by many more countries many more and much larger countries too, thus making the survey much more interesting. What's next? Currently, they are collecting the data for round 3 of the research. First of all, we need to expand the set of indicators, because the first attempt was all right, it was interesting. Now we need to expand the indicators. Secondly, we need to expand the countries included in the survey, because without a significant number of countries, a significantly large sample, no statistically significant research is possible. Then we need to shape a pool of contextual indicators. This is priority number 1 in my view, because an attempt to understand the reasons for this differentiation across educational systems without having handy good data on the contexts, social and economic indicators, demographies, you name it, that would be meaningless. And finally, something I mentioned before, we need to work out the methodology to account for regional variation of the purchasing power of the national currency. It has been resolved in Russia in more than one version vis-à-vis the fiscal spending and private spending as well. So we have resolved this matter in Russia. We use the fiscal spending index, or by computing the consumer basket, whatever. It is not very clear what is the situation elsewhere in the world. We need to discuss it further. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Mark Lvovich. Colleagues, you're welcome to ask questions, if any. Yes, please, but give your name. You need to press the green button before you speak, the lower one. Yes. Slutsky, Institute of Economics, Russian Academy of Sciences. Your page or your slide with your first hypothesis, that one. You see, there's a surge out there. If you take it out, I think our square would be something different. Maybe that is to say that when the regional differentiation of the share of population with tertiary education, if this surge is taken out, it seems all very smoothed out. So this averaged approach may not be very correct or very precise. Thank you. It was a comment, wasn't it? Well, we need to have another look at it to play with figures. But thank you for what you said. I have a question now. Marko Lvovich, could you say, do you have any observations or a tentative formulation of to what extent this subnational differentiation on various indicators is linked to the quality of education at high schools or in the tertiary educational system? Do you have any observation or interpretations or any approaches to try to understand that linkage, if any? I regret to say PISA is not a representative survey region-wise. So it is not a regionally representative thing. That's the way it is built. That's the way the sample is built. It's only representative for the nation as a whole. So as of now, there are no such research has been done. Maybe Martin would tell us more. There are some data from UNESCO about the differences of levels of education or quality of education within the same megalopolis, like in São Paulo in Brazil. But those are intranational things. Internationally, yes, people try to do something about it. Anything else? Thank you, Mark Lvovich. We are giving the floor to Martin Carnoy. Please put his presentation on. regional differences in federal countries, Australia, Brazil, and the United States, using regional differences to estimate the effects of state and mid-level management.
Спасибо. Добрый день. Очень приятно быть. So, Mark, thank you very much for talking about these regional differences. I think that it's a very important subject. So I'm going to talk to you about trying to use these regional differences to begin to understand if there are possibly mid-management levels of quality that affect educational outcomes. So a lot of the countries that Mark talked about are centrally run countries. So talking about regional differences between those countries, you're not talking about management differences, although obviously there might be regional differences even within a centrally run system, and that's worth exploring. But let's start out with countries in which are called federal systems, and these systems, by definition, are educational systems are run at subnational levels. And although federal governments can, in various ways, depending on the country, influence educational policy quite a lot, jurisdictionally, legally, in most of these countries, the educational system of the state or the region is actually controlled by regional or state authorities. And therefore, they do have, by definition, a lot of influence on what happens in those systems. There's a lot of variation between states in educational outcomes, even correcting for SES difference between states and regions. And within these federal countries, even when you correct for SES differences in the students who attend schools in these different states and regions, and even in the differences in resources available to the schools in the regions. So let's focus on the United States for a second, because in the United States, the federal government at the level of kindergarten to 12th grade, so end of secondary school, the federal government really has minimal influence on what the states do. Now, there have been attempts in accountability systems. Strangely enough, under George, there was an accountability system put in place by the Clinton administration, but it was voluntary, and the states could or could not put in this accountability system. Under George Bush, it became, strangely enough, because the Republican administrations usually believe that the states should have more control, not less control, they put in a mandatory accountability system in which all states had to test the children and report the results and pay, in some sense, be penalized if the states, if their systems weren't meeting the accountability standards. So there is really a lot of variation in the United States among states. And we have data, we have a lot of data on what's going on in the states in terms of outcomes, not only in terms of outcomes, but in terms of everything. We have an enormous amount of data. So focusing on those data, we can look at international tests, two kinds of international tests, just like in Russia. United States takes both PISA and TIMSS, and unlike Russia, international tests have been applied to random samples in some U.S. states, and also, for example, I'll talk later about Brazil and Mexico and Australia and Germany, all of whom do, to some extent, random samples in the states, in their states. Australia in all states and Germany all states. Now here's something interesting, Mark. Germany has had these data from 2003 and won't let anybody see them, in which they do randomized samples within the states and won't let you. One researcher got hold of the 2003 data, and that was it. After that, they didn't allow any more analysis for political reasons. But the data are there. Other countries do allow us to see the data. And TIMSS has been sampling in a few U.S. states since 1995, and in 2011 they sampled in 9 states. And after 2011, the United States took its national test, which is National Assessment of Educational Progress, and keyed it to the TIMSS. In other words, now you can, after 2011, or even in 2011 and 2015, you can get the equivalent of TIMSS results for every state in the United States. So the results in these countries show considerable variation in student performance among states, even adjusted for family academic resources far. So let me show you some of these results. So this is PISA. Now, in PISA, we only have 3 states that took the PISA. This was in 2012. We had a couple of states that took it in 2015. But let's look at the 2012 data. So if looking from left to right, from where you're sitting, Florida is on the left, Connecticut is the next state, and Massachusetts is the 3rd state. And then I've listed some countries: France, Germany, UK, US, Canada, Finland, Korea, and Poland, and Ireland. So let's look at this carefully. US does not score high in PISA mathematics and scores a bit better in reading. But look at this variation. If you look at Florida, Florida is, even in reading, practically below every country except Germany, UK, and is even lower than the average in the US, slightly lower. On the other hand, Massachusetts has reading scores which are higher than any of these PISA countries, any of them, which include Finland and Korea, high-scoring countries, and Poland, high-scoring country. Does better than all of them. In math, which is considered very weak in the United States, according to PISA, Massachusetts does not do significantly worse than any country in this group. These are all corrected for socioeconomic differences, by the way. Doesn't do any worse than any country except Korea. This is Massachusetts, a country of 6.5 million people, which is 50% larger than Finland, by the way, and much more diverse than Finland, has a substantial black population and Hispanic population. So looking at differences among states in a country, in a federal country, makes total sense. In fact, it raises doubts about why there are any comparisons between a country like Finland or Korea, which is centrally run country, or Poland, which is centrally run country, and the United States. The United States does not have an educational system as the United States. There is no U.S. educational system. Has everybody absorbed what I just said? There is no U.S. educational system. There are 51, at least 51 different systems. Los Angeles has 800,000 students, one district, 800,000 students. New York has 1 million students, the District of New York. This is bigger than many OECD countries. Just that one district. And they're run as separate districts. Now, of course, New York is run as part of New York State, and Los Angeles is run as part of California. But they have tremendous autonomy to do what they want. In state TIM's performance, I want to bring up another issue, and that is in terms of gains. These are to 2011, and we have 4 states with which we can do this. So we can look at TIM's gains in math in 4 states, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Indiana, and North Carolina. And you can see that in all those states, except Florida, except Connecticut, the gains in mathematics are higher than in Finland, Korea, England, and the U.S. as a whole. So gains in the TIMs, which are important because they show the gains over time in terms of, in some sense, how well these states are implementing educational policies, are larger in 3 of the 4 states than in countries like Finland, which has had a decline in the TIM score, Korea, which had a slight increase, and England, which has had an increase. Now, here, let's get to some more interesting comparisons, because now I want to get to the things about management. So what can we do to start looking at management of systems and what effect the management might have on what's going on in education in the states? So here are 2 states which are next to each other, Minnesota and Iowa, all right? They're both high-scoring states, rather homogeneous in terms of their populations, pretty much white European origin. And yet, in one case, just look at the solid lines, because these are adjusted, the solid lines are adjusted for socioeconomic class differences they're all adjusted to the U.S. average. And you can see that the dark line, which is the higher lines, Minnesota, the increase since 1996 has been much greater than in Iowa. Very similar states, adjoining states, and yet one state has high gains in mathematics and the other state doesn't. Why? Economic conditions are slightly better in Minnesota, but not much. And it has to do something that Minnesota did in this period that Iowa didn't do. And I can tell you some of the things that Minnesota did do, but I'm not going to because of the time. But if you're interested, I can tell you something. And by the way, as we go state by state, they all did about the same thing in order to get improvement. Okay? We know how to improve. We know how to manage improvement at the state level in mathematics learning and reading. We just have to have the evidence to show that. Here's a case that's really incredibly interesting. These are 2 states, small states next to each other, Connecticut and Massachusetts. Now, until 2003, they had almost identical unadjusted and adjusted scores. Starting in 2003, Massachusetts begins a huge rise in its math scores. By the way, in reading, the difference between the 2 states doesn't increase very much. But in mathematics, it increases by a half a standard deviation in 10 years. That's enormous. You won't find any intervention that you can think of that will produce a half a standard deviation in 10 years gain of all these what works interventions. So a management, something about what was going on in Massachusetts that had to do with state management of the system had this enormous effect on mathematics scores. Connecticut's right next door. Also a high spending, high scoring state with very high socioeconomic class on average, with also some diversity like Massachusetts. Texas and California. Now, they're not next to each other, but they're the 2 biggest states in the United States, 2 most populous states. And Texas, which is, you don't think of Texas as a educationally progressive state, but in fact it is. In mathematics, it made tremendous gains in the 1980s and continued those gains in the 1990s, somewhat higher than California, and maintained its differences with California even into the 2000s. Now, we know a lot of the things that Texas did to get that. California didn't do them until starting in 1998. They made some changes, but then they didn't put any money behind it. Texas increased its spending enormously in the 1980s per student. So now let's look at Brazil. In Brazil, these are the changes in the average national test over time. And what's really interesting about this, it is by level of mother's education. And so you can see that the scores declined as the system expanded greatly in the 1990s, and then began to increase at the bottom in the 2000s. They made some gains. This is in Portuguese score. Now, let's compare some states in Brazil. Now, this is on the national test. This is not on the PISA. But these are states which are relatively rich in the south of the country. And yet, you have one state, the top state, Minas Gerais. Can I get this state here? This is Minas Gerais, which is in north-central Brazil. And, I'm sorry, mid-central. It's just central Brazil. It's just west of Rio de Janeiro. And you can see tremendous gains compared to the other states in Minas Gerais on the national test. These are all states that should have done, that are all high-scoring states. Now we go to some very poor states in the Northeast, and we have one state, Ceará. Now this is a very poor state in the Northeast, and yet with tremendous gains in mathematics scores, ninth grade mathematics scores. What did they do that's different from these other states? Well, we know that they did a lot of things. It was a management intervention that made Ceará made big gains in test scores. We did a similar study of Australia. This is a published study. And the Brazil study is also published, by the way. And look what's happening in Australia. This is a good puzzle for Schleicher. The test scores in Australia have dropped by 0.3 of a standard deviation, the math scores, on average, since the year 2000. They've just gone steadily down, and nobody can understand why. All the reasons that were given by Australian policymakers all turned out to be incorrect. However, the two most populous states, which are New South Wales and Victoria. Victoria is Melbourne, and New South Wales is Sydney. Those two states actually had somewhat different trajectories in their test scores. So the test scores that are adjusted are, the solid lines. Solid. So you can see Melbourne's test scores didn't go up, but they also hardly went down except for the last 2015. And yet New South Wales scores steadily went down. So maybe Victoria did something that New South Wales didn't. And there are some differences in their educational policies and how they intervened in classrooms in math teaching. So people have to study that more. Right now it's just fairly anecdotal. Now, it isn't just differences in states that are important. Mark mentioned inter-district differences. So in Brazil, the state's educational system is very complicated because the primary schools are run almost entirely by municipalities, not even by states, by municipalities, by even smaller units. And the states and municipalities have middle schools, 6th to 9th grade. And then the states are almost exclusively, have almost exclusive control over secondary schools. Now, if you wanted to invent an inefficient way to run systems, that would be probably the system you would have. It's very, very complicated because states often have nothing to say about what the municipalities do, even though they're supposed to cooperate with the municipalities. So what you can do is you can look. What we were able to do is look at value added within regions, and by the way, the states even run their systems with regional offices, which have some autonomy in the way they run the schools. So in Sao Paulo, for example, which is the biggest state in Brazil with 40 million people, they have 92 different regions of the state running pieces of the state system, regional pieces, sub-regional pieces within a state. And they have over 1,000 municipalities running their own little educational systems. By the way, in the United States, districts have a lot of power. And so California has over 1,000 school districts with considerable control over the system. So what we did was looked at 3 cohorts of students from 5th to 9th grade, the gain in their test scores from 5th to 9th grade, 3 cohorts of students, of the same students. Notice in this case we could look at individual students, and we control for their social class and their gains, and we found that this list of regions of the state, the sub-regions within the state, they all appeared that 2 or more of their cohorts were in the highest value added, the highest 15 value added out of the 92 regions. And in Portuguese, there were another group of regions, and there's some overlap. So I've marked in dark face, in dark type, these 5 regions that appear both in Portuguese and in mathematics to have consistently the highest gains in the state from 5th to 9th grade, those regions. And then, at the other end, we have those that appear consistently in the lowest 10 to 15 regions, lowest gains. And you can see that there are 3 regions that appear both in mathematics and Portuguese. So, we don't know what these regions did versus these regions that made them so different in their ability to improve educational scores for these students in middle school. But this is a very important issue. What did they do? Because this gives us a clue of the kind of practices at middle management that could work to really improve what happens to children and youth in these schools. So what does this all tell us? Well, first of all, there's important variation in student achievement progress over time among administrative units. And in some cases, these are consistent over time. They keep appearing over and over and over again. And this variation exists even after we adjust for student social class, classroom and school level variables such as teacher experience and education. And we looked at states in the US, Australia, Brazil, and administrative units within Brazilian states. and we observed these differences at all these levels and in all these countries. We have the advantage in many Brazilian states that we can link individual students with their achievement scores and follow their achievement scores across grades, and we can link their achievement gains with their teacher characteristics. This allows us to estimate which regions and municipalities within a state, such as Sao Paulo, seem to have consistently increasing student achievement more in 5th and 9th grades, and those that are not doing as well. So what are the implications? Well, these are baseline data. These are just data. These are just the performance, student performance data. They provide evidence of differences that may be due to the quality, of state and municipal management of education. It's another thing to show that middle management is the likely cause of such differences. But even if we can't show cause, we can possibly identify differences in management between higher and lower performing administrative units, and this is an important topic for further research. And we're about to undertake such research in 2 states of Brazil, São Paulo and Pernambuco, one huge state. São Paulo and Pernambuco is the 7th largest state and in a very poor region of Brazil. And we're going to do this also in a number of U.S. states. Now, what about Russia? Russia has 80 regions. Let's say that PISA is given in 40 of those regions, and TIMSS is given in about 40 regions. So the data exists in Russia to compare regional administrative efficiency, but they're not readily available to researchers. It's a problem in Russia. There are data. I mean, Russia doesn't have that great data as Brazil, for example. I mean, Brazil is allegedly a less developed country, and it has much better data than Russia. So you should be concerned about that. But secondly, you have data, and you don't make it available to researchers. If we could get GIA data, and even though GIA is given separately, administered separately in each state, and even though GIA really just tells you 3, 4, 5, doesn't really differentiate very much between the test scores of students, but even so, if we could get GIA data and Oecd data, even by school, even by individual school, over the past 5 or 6 years, in the more populous and perhaps adjoining regions, and gather socioeconomic data about the schools and about the schools' physical locations, these thousands of observations of school academic performance over time could be aggregated to the region level to show relative educational administrative differences between the regions by seeing if, in fact, students are making bigger gains in some regions than in others, and try to investigate why that's so. So we can then study the sources of these differences between regions. And this is important because it's likely that there are large effects on student achievement in middle-level administrative practices. Now, I don't want to say that the only thing that affects students in regions is the quality of the school system, because that is absolutely not true. We do know, for example, in the United States, a state like Ohio has a good educational system as far as test scores are concerned, et cetera. But Ohio has economic problems that, for example, California or New York State or Massachusetts does not have. And what happens to people in Ohio is not just the outcome, is not just the result of what happened, how good their educational system, but is also about the vagaries of economic development. It happens that Ohio used to be a highly industrialized state, and industry just went away. And therefore, the conditions for many people in Ohio are pretty poor. Yet, we also know that a state like Iowa, which had one of the best educational systems in the United States back in the 1980s and 90s, now it didn't, as I showed you, it hasn't kept up with states like Minnesota. But even so, the educational system is good in Iowa, and yet Iowa is a struggling state. It's a struggling state, and the higher educated people in Iowa, thanks to the good educational system, are leaving. They're getting jobs elsewhere. So you could argue that one of the effects of a really good educational system is that it enables people to leave. And maybe that's important. Maybe that's important, because if you're stuck in a bad economic situation, you're just stuck. If you can leave, at least you can leave and go to where the opportunities are better. So I think we have to explore all these aspects of the management of the system and what affects, what makes the system good or bad, and also the economic factors, which may be more important than the quality of the educational system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin, for your talk. Colleagues, you are welcome to ask questions. Please give your name.
I'm from Guadalajara, Mexico, and working now there in the Pan American University. And it seems to me, probably I'm wrong, that there is a simple answer to these concerns. Tell me how much you are spending on education, and tell me how you are spending on education. For instance, controlling for corruption. And after this, it seems to me that this difference will not be so big, or at least will not be statistically significant. What do you think about it?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, it seems to me there's a simple answer for this. Spending. Tell me how much are you spending and how you are spending. And I would like to know what you think about it, because it seems to me that after controlling for this spending factor, the difference will not be so significant.
Well, I mean, you say you want to control for spending. I mean, why do you want to control for spending? If spending is one of the things that makes your educational system better, I mean, there's a big controversy on whether spending more makes your system better. I think in the states, in the United States that I showed you, those states, one of the factors that got those test scores higher was that they, during a period of about 10 years, they really increased the spending in order to get the test scores higher. So if I want to control for that and say, oh, gee, if I control for the spending, it shows that the test scores didn't really go up. I mean, why would I want to do that? I mean, if spending is the issue, if spending is the way you get spending is one of the ways that you get the test scores up. Now, why do you have to spend more? See, that's really interesting. And what do you have to spend on? So, do you increase teacher salaries? Not necessarily. In Connecticut, they increased teacher salaries a lot in the 1990s, but it didn't do anything to the math scores. In Massachusetts, they had high teacher salaries, not as high as in Connecticut, but what they spent on was teacher training in order to teach new standards, higher standards. So if you spend money on actually training the teachers to be better teachers, you might have an effect. If you just increase salaries, you might not have an effect. But I think what I really want to control for is not the spending, but I want to see why the spending might have had an effect or not. In Texas, they did raise salaries, and they also spent a lot more per student in other ways over a period. They started at a very low level, and they increased spending way more than in the national average during a long period of time, 1980 to 1992. And they had, apparently, they spent it in a way that increased test scores. So I think the issue is not to control for spending, but to see what's happening with the spending. Two of our researchers in the international lab are just completing a study showing that there's apparently a significant relationship between raising teacher salaries in Russia in regions how big the salary increase was, and how much the test scores, the Oecd scores, increased. So, on the other hand, overall spending didn't have any effect. Teacher salaries were quite low, and they raised them. So, I don't agree that you should control for spending. I think you should find out whether A, spending is a component of the increase, and if it is, was there a particular way that the spending was done, and there are other ways that it doesn't work. Okay? Alabama spends very little on education, the state of Alabama. You've heard of Alabama? They spend very little by choice. By choice, they spend very little on education, and they have a really terrible educational system. Okay? Doesn't mean... I mean, it's hard to have a good educational system without training your teachers and spending a lot of money on training teachers, right? So, you know, but there are economists who say, oh, spending doesn't make any difference. Yeah, live in California, and you find that hard to believe, because we have one of the lowest, particularly correcting for cost of living, we have one of the lowest spending in the United States. And we also have one of the worst educational systems in the United States.
Пожалуйста, ваш вопрос.
Yes, please. Gorbushov, Institute of Philosophy, Russian Academy of Sciences. Thank you. I thank Mark and Martin, and for the young man for the question he asked as well. Clearly, in modern education, there are lots of systems, financial systems, organizational systems, you name it. Let me say a few words about finance. Recalling the Russian history, previously, teachers were only working for food, and they were able to train good students. That's not what I'm calling for. Of course not. But still the question is, in your research, did you compare the motivation of students and their parents and their financial capacity, financial status, leaving everything else apart? Are modern-day students interested in getting good high school education nowadays, as well as their parents? Because I've encountered many times that people say to young people, it's enough for you, that parents say, it's enough for you to complete 4 grades at high school because it is better than I did myself doing only 3. So this is a question about motivation. And secondly, early this year, maybe at the end of last year, UN published a report, UNESCO published a report on research about saying that about 250 million children in the world not having access to education, and one of their proposals was, it was the United Nations, apart from the key participants to the educational process, which are parents, students, parents and teachers in Russia, they suggest to add the president, the assembly deputies and journalists to boost the motivation behind getting this or that level of education. What do you think about that? Would it be advisable to do so? Motivation and adding the media and other actors to promoting the education. Thank you.
It's a pretty complicated question, but you know, education is an interesting process because it does involve day school and night school, and the different management is in charge of day school than management in night school. Night school's run by the parents, and day school's run by the schools and the teachers, and the combination is what produced. There's a night shift and a day shift, and you're saying what role does the night shift have? Well, night shift is important. What role does the day shift have? Well, the day shift is important. If you don't have teachers who can engage the students, and you don't have parents who really know how to intervene in clever ways in order to motivate their kids, yeah, it's harder to educate kids, have kids be motivated to learn, than it is when you have, clever parents who know how to manipulate their kids to be more motivated, and you have teachers who really know how to teach in ways that engage all kids. We're just completing a study of Russian schools, of 30 Russian schools that were 30 out of the 220 schools that were in the TIMSS sample of 2011. It's really a fascinating study. We went to these 30 schools, and to find out what the schools saw as their mission, what the teachers were doing. We filmed math classes, and I'm not going to go through that whole thing, but the results are incredibly interesting, because it turns out that a minority of the math teachers we observed, when I say a minority, I would say about 20% of the teachers actually had engaging, interesting math classes, and the rest, the 80%, didn't. So when you're sitting in a math class where the teacher is only working with a few of the kids and the rest of the kids are fooling around and not engaged, it's pretty clear that most of the kids are not going to learn very much math. Okay, so you can argue, you should say, well, how can that be? Well, I don't know if they're working for food, but they're certainly probably not paid enough to be so that you can really exact demands on the teachers. They probably were trained pretty well in Russia at one time, but a lot of these teachers are older and have lost, they aren't retrained in the latest methods. So, anyway, so I mean, we know all that. And then the question, I think the better question to ask is, why aren't people motivated enough to force the state to actually make education, to put as much attention to education as they do to, for example, in my country, medicine? Why are doctors, why do we spend tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars to train a doctor, and we spend very little to train teachers, and we don't put much emphasis on it? We don't certify. Our certification of teachers is very minimal. We don't demand that teachers, and provide them the training that they really can really understand how to do their job. Every one of them, So, I don't know. We also don't teach kids anything about being parents. When you were in school, did you learn anything about being a parent? Anybody teach you anything about how to be a parent? It's probably the most important job you'll have in life if you have kids. And yet nobody teaches you anything about it.
Nobody wants kids now.
Well, if nobody wants kids, boy, there are a lot of kids if nobody wants them. And maybe if they're having them, maybe they don't want them, but they're having them. And their parents, and they're people that really can do this naturally, just like they're teachers that are really good teachers naturally. But that's a small percentage of parents, and that's a small percentage of teachers. So we don't prepare people to do these important tasks, and yet we expect kids to be engaged, we expect kids to want to learn, and we expect all these things of kids. And in some societies, kids are highly motivated. I wouldn't say to learn, I would say to learn how to take tests so that they can be successful on tests. And we have pretty good methods for that. Anyway, I think education is a really complex process, and obviously engaging students to want to learn is a very, very important thing to do, and we don't do a terribly good job on it, on average.
Спасибо.
Thank you. We have some time for another brief question or comment or remark. Mark, yes, please. I have a brief question and a brief comment on your question. I quite agree with Martin that it's not so much about control, but what exactly money is spent on. But your question contained a phrase, how much is spent on education. Pardon? More importantly, how? But let me say, first of all, mention about how much. Our research shows, I mean international comparison research, shows there's a certain borderline below which, however much you spend on education and however much you pay to teachers, everything is bound to be bad. And above that same line, you can spend as much as you can, it will not be much better. There's a clear borderline, or better to say, a border area, and we see it from interregional differentiation studies. That is not that conspicuous, but it is clear that the amount of spending has little effect on the outcomes. That's number one. And I have a question. Martin, please tell me, what do you think? What are the characteristics of the managerial activity, I mean management practice? What aspects of that has a strong influence on the educational outcomes? Thank you.
Well, I just totally don't agree with the first part of your analysis. I don't think you can talk about a threshold over, I'm looking at cross-section studies. First of all, you don't know how the people are spending the money. Look, there are two variables in spending on education. Two variables determine pretty much all the level of spending. Is that class sizes and teacher salaries. That's it. If you multiply teacher salary times class size, tells you how much you spent. Pretty much for K to 12, not talking about universities. So you can raise the class size, lower teacher salary, keep the spending the same. And by the way, in union negotiations in California, for example, back in the 70s, when there were declining numbers of students, the teachers elected to keep increasing their salaries and also increasing the class sizes by eliminating schools, closing schools, and firing teachers. But the remaining teachers want to get they prefer to have higher class sizes and higher salaries. Okay, now the parents may not have agreed with that, but I'm just saying that these two variables pretty much determine it. Now, we'd have some evidence from experiments that much lower class sizes do have a positive effect on student performance. It's expensive, but it does have a positive effect on student performance. And we do know that when teachers are paid very little, by raising teacher salaries, you can increase motivation of the teachers. Okay, so we have some evidence of that. However, nobody talks about other things that go into the spending. For example, you may not want to raise teacher salaries, but you want to increase spending on teacher training. You may want to really spend a lot of money on teacher training and make sure that the teachers are well trained. You can find many, many different ways to improve teacher training by spending more money. You can hire better teachers, you can lengthen the time of the teacher training, you can increase the practical end of the teacher training, which means you have to have teachers do teacher practice in schools for a longer period of time. You can pay the people who supervise the student teachers. You can choose the best teachers and pay them extra salaries in order to supervise. I mean, there are just lots of ways to improve teacher training. Look at medical training, and you have a good idea of what teacher training should really look like if you did a good job. Okay, now there are other people that say you don't have to train teachers at all. You can just stick them, teach for Russia or teach for America. Just says, stick them 2 months. We can train a teacher in 2 months, as long as you have a smart person. You can also raise teacher salaries for younger teachers so they can recruit better people into teaching without raising teacher salaries for older teachers. So that there are even ways to spend money there. So if you just look at general spending, it doesn't tell you much. Now, the second question is much simpler to answer, and that is we know what makes for better schools. Harder curriculum, better curriculum, not harder curriculum, better curriculum, a better curriculum, and the teachers trained to teach that curriculum. You can't just put in a better curriculum. You have to train people to teach it. And that costs money. And in all the states in the United States that showed this improvement, those were the 3 components that made a difference. Higher standards in mathematics, which were developed in 1988, implemented in all these states, teachers trained to teach those standards, and this was done over a long period of time. This was done over 4 or 5 years, and that cost money, and that money was spent in order to train the teachers to do this. That was most of the spending. So these were decisions made by these states, and they were implemented. Now, in a case like Massachusetts, it's pretty interesting, because Massachusetts has many, many small school districts. It's very hard to manage, because there are all these small school districts, and yet they were able to do it. In Texas, the school districts are much bigger, and yet they were able to do it. They put in in all these states, they also put in accountability systems. In other words, they measured what was happening in each of these school districts, in each of the schools. And if things were not going well, principals were fired and replaced by other principals. That was generally the sanction that was put on. So all these states shared accountability, higher standards, better teacher training to teach the standards, and accountability systems to measure what was happening in the schools, and spending more money in order to, over a 10-year period, in order to make this happen. Now, I can't prove that that caused the higher test scores. It's just a correlation between what they did and what they didn't do. In Brazil, we're just starting the study, but I'm sure that we're going to be able to find out what's going on there. What are the factors that improve, that made some of these regions do much better than others? I think the main thing that I'm trying to tell you is that mid-level management is important. The decisions that are made at the regional level in federal systems are really important for what happens in those regions educationally. And there are lots of decisions that mid-level managers can make in order to improve the educational systems.
Коллеги, давайте поблагодарим Марка.
Colleagues, let's thank Mark and Martin for their very interesting talks. And this has been very inspiring and motivating about how the education system should be more successful. And there's a surprise talk by Isaac Frumin, High School of Economics Institute of Education. Dear friends, I have a responsible mission before me. The rector was supposed to do this, Mr. Kuzminov. However, this session with participation of the Moscow City Mayor was postponed, and where he is a chair, and he asked me to substitute for him. So this is a surprise, because today we make the opportunity of having Professor Carnoy again in Moscow at his second job where he is academic consultant for the International Lab for Educational Policy Analysis, and that has been since 2011. And the Academic Council of the High School of Economics here has awarded Professor Carnoy an important award of this school. This is the Medal of Academic Honor, Academic Honors Medal. That's the title of it. This is the highest award to be given to international faculty of the High School of Economics for their outstanding contribution to this university. I must say that indeed we've been very fortunate indeed that Martin agreed to work with us. Recently, him and I attended an international conference with 3,000 participants from all around the world on comparative education, and I think Professor Carnoy was one of the most popular persons at that conference for the simple reason, not because he's so entertaining person as he is, which is true, he is, and it's very good, but because he has nurtured at Stanford in the first place and now at the High School of Economics here, and has had a strong influence on the University of Beijing, on a large group of outstanding researchers, primarily at Stanford. Some of his former students are at the steering wheel of states and governments and corporations. During my time at the World Bank, there were many people trained by him that I encountered, and today I cannot but say, as I give him this medal, that I do envy his unbelievable biography. He is directly connected to Russia, at least to the Soviet Union, because he survived, because when the Nazis invaded Poland, his parents fled to the Soviet zone. It was very difficult. Stalin and Hitler agreed not to allow people pass through, but his father was a very entrepreneurial person. He managed his family to be allowed in, and from Lviv, that was Soviet but still not occupied, from that place they moved over to the United States, where Martin graduated.
To 1960, he graduated from one of the best technological universities, the California Institute of Technology. In 1964, he got a PhD at the Chicago University. One of his supervisors was the guy who later became Nobel Prize winner, one of the creators of human capital theory, Theodore Schultz. And can you imagine, this year Stanford University will be marking half a century of Martin Carnoy's work as a professor at Stanford.
Right. Yeah.
And over this time, he grew from an assistant teacher, professor, a full professor, and as colleagues are saying, he remains as active as he used to be. 50 years ago, several years ago, Martin, with the support of the Brazilian philanthropists, a center for education research at Stanford, Brazil Education Research Center, which is one of the most interesting and dynamic venues to study comparative education. Books by, I will not list his articles and books, and within several months we jointly edited and Simon Marginson and Legli Gushov, there will be a book about federal systems. And he's not only editing, but also writing soon the history of comparative education in the United States, and a book will come out of that. Among his books, there are books that had a great impact. There's a famous photo, where Korean students, during the rebellion that toppled their dictatorship in Korea, holding his book in their hands, Education as a cultural imperialism. At that time, Martin was quite left-wing, which is clearly seen from his famous book, written together, Levin, Education and Labor in Capitalist Societies. Education and work in capitalist societies. That's widely quoted and continued to be a seminal work based on vast empirical data. When I think about what helps Martin maintain this interest and involvement after so many years of work, I think it's his interest in and for reality. It is he who made us, encouraged us at the lab here not only to do number crunching, but to go to schools. And the book that is to come out in Russia will, as strange as it may seem, will be the first systematic study of what is going on at schools, which will combine numbers and real observations, empirical observations, and hundreds of video recordings of real-life classes. During the time of his tenure at HSC, his lab actually began with a microgroup, with 2, then 3, then 2, and now, and he told me yesterday, he doesn't know what some of them are doing now, because people are taking interesting topics and develop them on their own. And actually that is why we invited him. And so on behalf of the top management, on my personal behalf, on behalf of the Russian colleagues who had the pleasure of working with Martin, I'm happy to present him with this medal and wish him the best of life and many years of cooperation with us. For me, it's a great honor and I want to thank everybody at the university and my friend Isaac Frumin, and my friends at the lab.
This is a great thing for me. Even after all these years, I love to get honors. Always feels good to get a plaque for my wall. And so I greatly appreciate. For me, as you know, Isaac, this is a labor of love. I think we professors at elite universities are under tremendous pressure to do a lot of research, and we're very proud of our research. I read books that I wrote many years ago, and I'm amazed that I wrote those books. I don't think I could do it today, but I have to say that at the end of everything, it's our responsibility as teachers. We've been talking about teachers. We also have a responsibility as teachers, and many professors at elite universities forget that we are teachers, and we are supposed to help students to become as good or better than we are at being both economists or sociologists or educators or whatever we want them to be. It's our job to help as many students as we can to become the next generation of researchers and teachers. And so for me, working with the people in the lab and seeing what happened in this lab and seeing their growth is enormously satisfying to me. It's almost less important what the research is. It turns out that very few people read our research, and even fewer people ever take it seriously to do something with it. But it is an important intellectual activity, and doing basic science and policy analysis is valuable, even though the politicians are too stupid to use the evidence that we produce in order to make the changes that we suggest. Even so, the activity itself is great, and working together is great. Just the intellectual activity of working together is what makes life interesting. So thank you very, very much for this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, colleagues, so much for this session. We have other sessions to come.